I hope you took on the challenge of creating random tensor of your own size. And just a little tidbit here, you might have seen me in the previous video, I didn't use the size parameter, but in this case I did here. You can go either way. So if we go torch.rand, size equals, we put in a tuple here of 3, 3. We've got that tensor there, 3, 3. But then also, if we don't put the size in there, it's the default. So it's going to create a very similar tensor. So whether you have this size or not, it's going to have quite a similar output depending on the shape that you put in there. But now let's get started to another kind of tensor that you might see, zeros and ones. So say you wanted to create a tensor that wasn't just full of random numbers, you wanted to create a tensor of all zeros. This is helpful for if you're creating some form of mask. Now, we haven't covered what a mask is, but essentially, if we create a tensor of all zeros, what happens when you multiply a number by 0? All zeros. So if we wanted to multiply these two together, let's do zeros times random tensor. There we go, all zeros. So maybe if you're working with this random tensor and you wanted to mask out, say, all of the numbers in this column for some reason, you could create a tensor of zeros in that column, multiply it by your target tensor, and you would zero all those numbers. That's telling your model, hey, ignore all of the numbers that are in here because I've zeroed them out. And then if you wanted to create a tensor of all ones, create a tensor of all ones, we can go ones equals torch.ones, size equals 3, 4. And then if we have a look, there's another parameter I haven't showed you yet, but this is another important one, is the D type. So the default data type, so that's what D type stands for, is torch.float. We've actually been using torch.float the whole time because that's whenever you create a tensor with PyTorch, we're using a PyTorch method, unless you explicitly define what the data type is. We'll see that later on, defining what the data type is. It starts off as torch float 32. So these are float numbers. So that is how you create zeros and ones. Zeros is probably, I've seen, more common than ones in use, but just keep these in mind. You might come across them. There are lots of different methods to creating tensors, and truth be told, like, random is probably one of the most common, but you might see zeros and ones out in the field. So now we've covered that. Let's move on into the next video where we're going to create a range. So have a go at creating a tensor full of zeros in whatever size you want, and a tensor full of ones in whatever size you want, and I'll see you in the next video.